the Surface. I'm Jarrett Fuller, and this is my podcast about design criticism and practice. On this week's episode, I'm talking to the designer, educator, architect, Justin W. Cook. This conversation feels like it's part of a series of interviews about strategic design and the Helsinki Design Lab. Justin worked with Brian Boyer and Dan Hill, who you may remember as former guests of the podcast, at Helsinki, and this conversation in so many ways picks up where those two conversations began. Justin is currently on faculty at RISD, where he runs a new initiative called the Complexity Lab and is really thinking about these ideas around strategic design and systems and organizations within an academic context. And we talk about all of this, how he started teaching and how to think about design in this sort of kind of educational framework and the work that he's doing at RISD now. But Justin originally studied architecture and worked as an architect for a while. And so we also talk about that and the value of an architecture degree and its relationship to his current research interests. It was just a really fascinating conversation for me that covers a lot of ground. If you liked my conversations with Brian and Dan, you will also love this one, I think. And if you're at all interested in thinking about design at truly the widest sense, Justin has thought really deeply about that, and I felt like I walked away from this conversation just with my head spinning with ideas and new things to think about. I think you're really going to like it. If you're a fan of the podcast and want to help support it, you can become a member for $5 a month or $50 a year to receive an exclusive monthly newsletter with additional content and episode previews. These memberships help keep the podcast going. I just really appreciate all of your support and hope that you enjoy this conversation with Justin W. Cook. I was doing some research on you and kind of thinking about the things that I wanted to talk about. And obviously my interest in you came from my conversations with Brian Boyer and Dan Hill and their work specifically around this idea of strategic design. And I noticed when I was researching you and thinking about what I wanted to talk to you about is that you also have a background in architecture. And so I kind of want to start there. Where did that interest come from? Did you want to be an architect? Did you want to kind of design buildings? What was kind of your goal when you were studying that?
Yeah, so I had an indirect pathway into architecture.
Oh, okay.
So from the very beginning, I remember wanting to become a surgeon.
Oh, interesting.
And so I went into school, and this was at University of Washington in Seattle, and there wasn't a pre-med program. So I enrolled in a cellular and molecular biology program,
geez.
and I felt that was obviously too skewed toward hard science. Mm. And so I did a dual degree in English literature. And okay. I got quite far through the biology degree into organic chemistry, which seems to be the crucible through which most, physicians either make it or not.
Yeah.
And I ended up just deciding that, I don't know, there wasn't a way to make sense of what I was learning the same way that I could with English literature. And so I started looking around for other opportunities within UW and trying to think about, what the future could be. And actually my grandmother mentioned architecture. Oh. And it's strange that I had never thought of it before because I come from a family of builders. My father was a master carpenter. Mm. My uncle builds some of the nicest homes around Tacoma and Seattle, Washington. Plumbers, but it's a family that really pays very close attention to craft. And, but I had never thought of architecture as any kind of career pathway. It just didn't register because I was so focused on medicine. Yeah. So I started, there's a few introductory classes that you have to take to get into the undergrad architecture program at UW, most of which are taught by Frank Ching or Francis Ching, who did, of course, the famous design drawing series. And I excelled at drawing, I remember doing an orthogonal drawing of a fishing reel and other things like that
Yeah.
that were necessary for me to apply to the program. And I got in, and I loved it, and continued the English literature and graduated. Went into a design build firm for a few years, which in Seattle at that time was a really vibrant way to practice architecture. It's not the kind of design build that you see at scale in big construction companies. It's very much like pencil and hammer simultaneously. And then went to work for a little while as a junior architect in a mega firm in Seattle. Did not like that. Went back and design build.
Right.
Applied to the GSD, and went from there.
That's really interesting. I have two questions kind of based on that are completely unrelated. The two questions are unrelated. I'm curious about the studying English literature. You kind of just threw that in there kind of off on the side. Where did that come from? Were you interested in writing and reading, or how'd that fit into all of this?
I mean, the narrative that I have, that I tell myself, is that that it was a way to balance the biology degree, but I don't know. I remember reading like Michael Crichton as a kid, and he sort of spanned that medical literature space neatly. He was also trained as a surgeon, or at least a physician, if I remember correctly. So that probably informed some of that. But I think I was also just deeply interested in trying to understand the human experience, although I had to become an English major to use that phrase.
Yeah.
But I found that rather than say anthropology, and I did take some anthropology classes, that the English literature was a very vivid way to access the human experience, and so that's really what kept me interested.
And then when your grandmother recommended architecture, and you kind of said how you're surprised you didn't think about it. What was your reaction to that? And when you started taking the classes and saw that you were pretty good at it, was it an immediate like, oh yeah, this is the thing?
Yeah, it was.
Okay.
It absolutely was. Yeah. I mean, for one thing, I went from an organic chemistry class of one professor to 300 students to a studio of, Frank Ching and 10 of us, which is just, especially at that age, it's a transformative kind of learning experience. Because really, even in AP English, in high school, it's still a class of 25. So to really have this kind of intimate, engaged, really mentorship, that hooked me. But the drawing hooked me. The access to the shop hooked me. There's so many things that, they had the building was a much nicer building than, the biology building. So I don't know. It was a kind of ecosystem of things that turned me on to architecture.
That's really interesting. So I just want to follow this timeline for a bit before we kind of start talking about your current work. So you went to work at a larger firm and didn't like that, and it was kind of right after that you decided to go back to school. You went to Harvard. Was that right after that?
Pretty much, yeah. So I was working there. Actually, I remember shipping my portfolio to Harvard and Yale and all the others out of the shipping department.
Nice.
At the firm. So I was definitely there. It was, this is before the collapse, well before the collapse, probably 2003, I would think. And at the time, they were running a division called program management, which was basically doing repetitive banks and other things, like especially Washington Mutuals, which at the time was expanding at an insane rate, but they were benefiting mightily from that that expansion. And so the work was, going to some former KFC in Texas somewhere and, sticking a bank in there.
Right.
So
that's interesting.
obviously that it was quite a departure from
Yeah.
the intimacy of design build. But on the other hand, what I did learn there is a rigorous approach to the production of the documents that enable efficient building. Like that was a big takeaway, and it was incredibly rigorous, and they had very few change orders as a result of that process. So that was valuable. And then I decided that it was time for an advanced degree. So the undergraduate program at UW is not a BArch.
Interesting.
Yeah, it's a Bachelor's of Architectural Studies. So I knew that in order to advance as an architect, obviously I had to do a higher degree, and I was interested in doing that in any case.
Okay, yeah, great. That was my exact next question, was kind of why you thought more education was next. So you were going into that program thinking, you're going to do this and then kind of go back to architecture?
Yes. Yeah, very much so.
Okay, so then how did I'm curious kind of how, I'm going to ask a really big question only because I don't know how else to ask it, and then we can kind of parse it out as we go. And I don't mean to kind of jump over, kind of a large part of your career, but I'm curious how much of your current work is architecture related, and I'm saying that in kind of architecture in the kind of traditional sense that you were interested in. And the reason I ask that is because I'm kind of curious. I guess the sub question to this is how you started to move away from kind of designing buildings into teaching, into strategic design, all of that sort of thing. So I realize that's a big question, but can you kind of talk about that a little bit?
Yeah. So my current work, if you're talking about architecture as it relates to buildings, I would say it's hardly related to that anymore.
Okay.
But architecture as a teaching tool is something that I use quite a bit, and as a way to understand how to engage problems, engage systems, and we can get into this later. But I would say I access my architecture training constantly.
Okay.
But the actual work related to the construction of buildings, I have a farm in Maine, and I go and I do my architecture thing up there.
Okay.
So I stay connected to building and to design, but not directly. Although I have taught in the adaptive reuse program here at RISD a few graduate level studios, and that was actually a desire on my part to reconnect with practice, with architectural practice and discourse, because I had, I was so immersed in the literature and the debates, the broader architectural discourse especially while at the GSD, and I had, by necessity, had to sort of leave that behind because I needed to gain new areas of knowledge, and so I felt a desire to reconnect with that, and so I did that through teaching. When
did you start teaching? Was that right after you had finished at Harvard, or how did that come in?
No. So teaching came later. I taught first studio at RISD in 2014.
Oh, okay.
I finished the GSD in 2008, just before the crash. So,
interesting.
No, it really came later, and it was while I was working at the Finnish Innovation Fund that I started teaching.
Okay, so let's come back to teaching later then, because I for some reason had thought that teaching came before the Finnish Innovation Fund. So how did you get connected with them and with those guys there?
Well, this gets to how did I stop?
Okay.
Being on a architecture trajectory. So my first studio at the GSD was actually with Brian. He sat very close to me, Brian Boyer, and our professor then was Marco Steinberg,
right.
who is one of my very favorite critics. I was just describing what distinguished him at the GSD to a colleague of mine, and it was how sort of nutrient dense his critique was, how rich it was. It was a standout. And so I thought, okay, this guy is doing interesting work. He has an amazing view on the world. And so after that studio, I came to him and I said, hey, if there's anything you want to work on, I'd love to work on it with you. And at that time, I was thinking it would be, I don't know, something to do with lighting or who knows what. But in 2005, 2006, he brought a few of us in and said that, he had begun a research project into ischemic stroke where you have a blockage in your brain. And would any of us be interested? And for me, of course, this reaches into my interest as a physician.
That's interesting.
In healthcare. So it was an immediate yes, because it was Marco that was the PI and it was a healthcare related problem. And so that project really, that, as I often say, that's the thing that destroyed my architecture career. In a way, happily so, at least as far as I can evaluate how that career would have gone. But that project was really, there was no return from that, except through teaching.
So you didn't have any hard feelings about kind of leaving that career that you thought you were going to have? It was like a very kind of no-brainer, like, yeah, I'm going to go do this other thing.
I mean, yes and no. So it wasn't I still had 2 years of school left. So it wasn't just a lights on off kind of process. Okay. It was more gradual, but later on, I definitely considered it. And I still often think about, do I need to actually go through licensure so I can close that chapter of my life? But then I just have to pay NCARB, or whoever it is every year to maintain that license. So I have never done that, but, there's really at this point no reason to, but I do feel, that was sort of left a bit open-ended. But I've made peace with that, but I haven't really regretted it. It introduces a whole host of challenges, because you immediately enter into a non-linear career pathway.
Right.
And there's a tremendous amount of uncertainty that comes with that.
Right. I want to try to, you said a couple things that I find really interesting that I want to try to cohere into a clear question. So bear with me for a second. But I think it's interesting that this project with Marco was healthcare, kind of healthcare related, and really echoed back to your early interest in being a surgeon and then you also mentioned how a lot of the work you're doing, you're pulling from your architecture education, even if it's not designing buildings. And I'm kind of interested in that relationship between the surgeon path and the architecture path, I guess, and how did you see overlaps there, like even back when you made that kind of definite shift from studying that to studying architecture? And then is there something about architecture that would let architects, or the way an architect thinks, even tackle this problem that you were tackling with Marco? You know what I mean? Okay.
Yeah. So to the first question, as I mentioned, my father's a builder, and so he and I framed a house together when I was 13, and I sort of continued in carpentry after that. And in fact, I think my first tortured sentence of my application to Harvard was something like, "I've been a carpenter since 13," something like that. Yeah. But I had always really enjoyed making and doing it precisely. There are some carpenters, especially framers, who say there's no 1/8 inch marks on your measuring tape,
Mm.
meaning, if you're within a 1/4 inch, it's close enough.
Okay.
And I had always loved tight fitting framing, and that's like what my father was really good at. And in fact,
Yeah.
when we framed this, there's this house that was connected to a older house, and the roof framing between the old house and the new house was really complicated. And I remember the client coming home to see us working on this, and he was like, "There's no way we can put sheetrock over this. It's just too beautiful, this framing." And I always understood that, in a surgery practice, that it's not a dissimilar
Right.
act. I mean,
Right.
it's bigger tools. I wouldn't say it's necessarily messy. Surgery is pretty messy.
Yeah.
It is lower stakes, of course, but there's a lot of similarities, I think, between at least the act of surgery and the act of carpentry.
Yeah. That makes a lot of sense now that you say that.
Yeah, and so that seemed quite like I remember before I was deep into the biology degree, trying to evaluate if I could be a good surgeon, which is a very abstract thing to do.
Yeah.
But the way that I gave myself confidence was to say, well, I know how to build well, and so perhaps. And to the second question, so this we call it the stroke project, and the stroke project, at that time there hadn't been any Helsinki Design Lab yet, at least as we knew it. Design thinking didn't really exist yet so much, or at least it wasn't as popular as it is today. Again, this is sort of 2005, 2006. Strategic design, I'm sure, didn't have a Wikipedia page back that it has much of now. But so we went into that with our architecture skills, right? We didn't go into it with like a strategic design approach because we didn't have that. We didn't have access to that. So, at that time we talk a lot about, using visualization and synthesis and trying to understand context in the same way that you'd understand a site in architecture, and how, all of these various forces converge on that site, either to, usually to complicate building a building. But, we sort of evaluated this problem, not as a healthcare problem, but as a structural problem. And we did that using the tools that we were either learning at the time as students at the GSD, or had learned before, or that we had already, in the case of Marco, gained as an architect. So, that project was pretty much an architecture project.
Right. That's interesting.
If you had taken a studio brief and removed the building from that, I think that's sort of how we approached it, sort of just as a studio problem.
Yeah.
Your studio problem.
It's interesting. I've talked to a couple people on the podcast. I talked to Brian about this. I have friends who studied architecture, and I find it so interesting how many people study architecture and then kind of go off to do things that are not architecture in that kind of traditional sense of kind of designing buildings that are meant to be built. And I'm kind of curious if you have thoughts on that. And you mentioned earlier about how so much of your architecture training is filtering into your work, whether it's kind of teaching or even, kind of approaching this project as the way you approach this as kind of an architecture project. What are some of those, what is it about that education that kind of either primed you, or even, if you want to speak more generally, to start to go off and kind of tackle challenges that are maybe not the way we think of architecture?
Yeah. It's that's the big question.
Yeah.
I so I think so. One way to look at this is through what architecture does, and if you think about what a building is, it's the convergence of many different things, right? It's structural systems, it's lighting systems, it's spatial systems, it's various kinds of human systems, including culture and identity and circulation and you name it. But it's also very other abstract things like value or values or the kinds of messages that clients want to transmit to the world about who they are and what their value sets are. Like it's all of these things built in a real place at a real time. And there's something in that coalescing of all of those usually competing dynamics, right? Certainly budget is competing basically with everything else, and the realness of a site, and the realness of a construction process that forces you as an architect to contend with a high degree of complexity. And I remember I did a side project while I was doing design build work to design a renovation for this house on Whidbey Island up in the Pacific Northwest. And it was the first time that I had really worked on my own as a so-called architect. And I remember sitting down. Of course, I was using a drafting table at the time because I was more confident physically drawing it than using CAD. And just being completely overwhelmed by the prospect of having a blank sheet of paper and where I needed to be to submit this to the building department. Like the structural plans had to be done, let alone the whole architectural design of it, material specifications. It was an absolutely overwhelming process, or specter of a process. And then I just started doing it, right? Started drawing, working on parts of it, working on sometimes small scale things, sometimes large scale things, and working in a very methodical way through the thousands of decisions that I had to make this thing happen for real. And again, I think that illustrates some kind of skill set that seems valuable today.
Right.
Where, the problems that we're working on today are, they're not discrete. There are problems today that are discrete, but the really interesting ones, in my view, are the ones that are not discrete. They're the ones that are ambiguous. They're the ones that are complex. They're the ones where, multiple systems are creating dynamics that are hard to understand. And, there's probably some thesis that needs to be written on this, but there's a connection between that quite typical architectural process and these kinds of complex problems, especially if you're interested in achieving some sort of impact, right? It's not just about analyzing them, it's about actually doing something about them. So that seems to be part of the connection. I think architecture training is also, it's done in a studio, and I think as a learning environment, as a environment for open inquiry, whether it's in architecture or sculpture or painting, whatever it is, these are important kinds of environments to tackling very complex kinds of challenges. I think that's the kind of setting that needs to be in place, and the kind of studio mentality, or set that one needs as they go into confronting these kinds of challenges.
Yeah. And now, did you think, I don't mean to make a connection here, or kind of to kind of stretch or kind of like oversimplify your own work, but did you see, what I'm trying to do is kind of connect this to teaching a little bit, because it seems like for you found that academia and the classroom environment is a way to kind of really put all of this into practice in a kind of very kind of clear and real way. Would you agree with that?
Well, so my role at RISD is has changed quite a bit,
Okay.
and we can get into that. But I think teaching in a master's level program is it's as real as it needs to be in order to advance students' understanding.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
the last studio that I taught, the topic was, I think that the title was Design for Neurodiversity. And the argument that I was making was, if architects had spent since the signing of the Americans with Disabilities Act and before working on sort of universal access design or universal design for physical disability, that there was a need, given the rise of mental health issues and how sort of prominent that those had become in our society, and how improved our understanding of mental health issues had become. There's an equivalent need then to take that on as a problem set for architects. So in that case, it gets quite real, because then you bring in, people that treat others who have a various form of dementia or OCD or bipolar disorder or whatever it is. And so that becomes a studio that's and a question that's very much engaged in the real world. But also that, the students then can take that wherever they want it. And that's where it becomes much more abstract.
So how did you kind of start getting into, how did you start teaching, or how did that start to kind of fit into this other work that you were doing?
So, after we did the stroke project, we finished our degrees at GSD, and Marco then was asked by the former Prime Minister of Finland, who was then the head of the Finnish Innovation Fund, to come and start to build this capacity at the fund. And, that led to Helsinki Design Lab, which I'm sure Brian talked more about, but my role there was a bit different initially. So I stayed more in an architecture sort of space. So we launched in 2009 a competition called Low to No.
Oh yeah.
Which it was sort of great timing, because all of the best architects in the world were looking for work. But also we spent an enormous amount of time putting together the competition approach and the brief, and anticipating how sort of being on the client side, but knowing the architecture side, how we could get those architects that would apply to behave or perform more like we did in the stroke project. So like the primary evaluation criteria for that competition was the nature of the team and how diverse it was, and the kind of breadth or spectrum of issues that it could take on. So that was a kind of clear extension of the architecture world and the stroke project world into a design and construction space. And we ran that competition. We had 5 finalist teams that we brought into Helsinki and worked with them, and then a team that was composed of led by Arup with Sauerbruch Hutton and the user experience design firm in Turin called Experientia. Okay. They won that. And so then the process became around actually building this city block that was intended not to be a demonstration project, but to help the market understand how the city could begin to be
interesting,
decarbonized.
Yeah.
And it's a much long story that I won't go into, but that was kind of my primary work, along with working with Marco and Brian through building out Helsinki Design Lab. And actually that's what helped bring Dan Hill onto our team, because he was part of that winning team. And so, that was, probably 2000, 2012 where that work began to conclude, and I switched over to working more with Helsinki Design Lab. And then we closed that in 2013. And the fund asked me to stick around and help build out a strategic research team that would be embedded within Citra, within the fund.
Oh, okay.
And bear in mind, this whole time I'm living in Cambridge and commuting to Helsinki.
Oh, okay. I didn't realize that.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. That's a minor detail.
Yeah, that's intense.
Yeah. So Brian moved there. Obviously,
Right.
Marco was there, but I stayed. And the idea actually behind that came from a couple of things. One is my wife and I were not ready to move, and another was that Esko Aho, who was then the head of Citra, as a former statesman, he thought, well, Finland's opportunities and challenges don't start and stop at the border, so maybe we need to take a more diplomatic core approach to how we staff this organization. It was a nice idea. It was basically only me.
Yeah.
What's the diplomatic core?
Yeah,
but
it is a great idea, though.
Yeah. And I had always hoped that there would be others. Later on, actually, during the strategic research team work, we had a guy in Taiwan. So it kind of happened, but
Right.
yeah, never fully realized vision. And so it was actually during that phase of my work with Citra that I started teaching in an effort to begin to reconnect with practice. Because being in Cambridge, I could go to the GSD or down here to RISD or to Northeastern or wherever to sit on reviews.
Right.
So I had some connection, and I really enjoyed those opportunities. And so I thought that it would be a good opportunity to do that more in depth. And Citra was very happy to have me begin academic work.
Right.
And they have a very liberal work week. I think it was 35 hours or something. That is
nice.
A full-time job there. So,
yeah.
So that was easy to do.
And so when you mentioned that your position at RISD has changed recently. I want to talk about that in a second, but I have one question before that. Just when you first started teaching, you were doing that while you were at Citra at the same time. How much kind of overlap or intersections were there between the types of classes you were teaching and the work you were doing with Citra? Were those related? Did you kind of see those as two separate things? How did that kind of fit together for you?
Well, there's the clear lineage between the GSD, the Stroke Project, and HDL, and the Low to No competition.
Mm-hmm.
Like that all made sense. But at the time, Citra was developing what we call the Sustainable Wellbeing Platform, which was basically an idea that, if we're honest about the state of our planet and the state of our societies, then we need to find a way to reorganize society around what we called sustainable well-being at the time. Mm-hmm. And so we began to develop that as a societal model, which I think from an American perspective sounds a little bit scary, but from a Finnish perspective, it makes a bit more sense to say that there's a societal model that actually needs to be thought through and put forth for others to think about and adopt. And that whole discourse, which was incredibly rich with my colleagues at Citra, and I really miss today that I don't have access, to those 2-hour Wednesday meetings that were really incredible. We're really thinking deeply about the future and about these huge topics of human well-being and sustainability, and bringing in all kinds of outside sources into that dialogue. That allowed me to bring a different kind of perspective into the teaching here that, my practice by that time had become very systems oriented.
Right.
But, and I would sort of structure my studios as such, but to be able to talk about things, different frames for understanding problems like sustainability, but in a much more sort of sophisticated way than just the typical energy systems or whatever it is, whatever frame many look at sustainability questions, or around human well-being, looking at social social systems, urban systems, like that brought a different lens into my studio and into the work of my students that I think was really valuable, and I think for some quite different and exciting.
Yeah.
And for some have, sort of had the same split in their career where it's like, it's hard to go back to a strictly architectural practice if that's something, if those sort of systems level issues begin to captivate
you were teaching in you were teaching architecture students then.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's something I think about a lot teaching in graphic design programs, and this comes up on the podcast a lot. I think it's because it's something I'm trying to articulate and figure out still for myself, is that balance isn't necessarily the right word, but that kind of to show my students, and I think graphic design is a little bit different than architecture, but to show that there's a very traditional way to kind of practice graphic design, but then these skills can also lead you into all of these other fields that are maybe not what we would call graphic design, kind of like what we're talking about in your own career. And how do you think about that, with your students, of kind of giving them the skills or the tools or the kind of modes of thinking to be architects, but then also to kind of show that these can also then help with other things?
Yeah, I think balance is the right way.
Okay.
But also I left the GSD feeling quite critical of where, at least as it was being realized at the GSD, where the field was headed. Because I felt like the discourse was so insular and circular. There were endless amounts of publications that we were either required to read or that everybody was reading, where the writers who were practicing architects usually, but in some cases theorists, who they were wrapping their ideas in sentence structures and in phraseology, and that made it useless to anybody outside such a narrow field. And I don't know. Architecture is a public act, and it's a slow one, and it has huge implications if it's not done well, as we know. And I don't know. I found that troublesome, and sort of set me on a more set me apart from the field a little bit, or gave me some distance from it and made me more critical of it. And so, to a certain extent, with my students, I never said this to them, but underlying my pedagogy was an idea about a field that's in crisis if it doesn't find a way to become more relevant.
That's so interesting.
That, there are all kinds of professions, organizations that are, and this is not a new idea, but are nibbling away at the field of architecture. And the response, at least at the GSD at the time, was to become more closed and more specialized. And I just felt that was highly problematic. And so I wanted to expose my students to a broader definition of practice, knowing that they'll, in their other studios and their other classes, they'll have access to, a traditional architecture training, which I think is important. But I think it's critical, actually. But I think at the same time that they need to be exposed to, one, a critique of the field, and two, different ways, how their skill sets can be operative in different kinds of environments.
Yeah, I love that. I feel like you actually kind of helped me articulate kind of some of my own feelings around graphic design, because I think, to a lesser extent, graphic design is kind of facing the same thing, with this is a very kind of simple example, but just the democratization of design tools where, anyone can kind of set up a Squarespace site or something like
Yeah.
that, you don't need to hire a web designer anymore. And so much of graphic design writing is so insular and kind of meant to kind of protect the institution from within instead of starting to look outward. And I think, there are so many relationships there to architecture that I hadn't made. And the way you talked about that, in a weird way, I think almost crystallizes what I've subconsciously been thinking about with my own students.
Yeah.
And so, I could talk to you about that for another hour. So I will move on because there's other things I want to talk to you about. But you've connected a bunch of things in my mind that I have not connected before. So thank you.
Sure.
So you mentioned that your job or your role has changed recently. So what are you doing now at RISD?
Okay. So let's see. It was around the time. It was a year after I taught my first studio at RISD. So it would have been 2015. I worked with the then head of continuing education / executive education, which was a sort of amorphous body at RISD. But what had happened is the U.S. State Department had approached RISD and basically said, we have invested a ton of money in design thinking and Luma and all of these toolkits, and we're not seeing the kind of strategic improvement in the capabilities, or at least lasting improvement in the capabilities of our workforce. And is there another way? Mm-hmm. So this is sort of getting to the end of a certain arc of design thinking, right, that wasn't present in the beginning of Stroke, of the Stroke project. So he reached out to me, and I said, "Oh well, I've been doing this thing at Helsinki Design Lab, right, and we have this what we call the HDL Studio model. I run a few of those at MIT, and maybe we can adapt this for what you're looking for." And so basically we took that 5-day engagement model and built it for a RISD kind of State Department client, so to speak. Huh. And so that became the Institute for Design and Public Policy, which that persists today, and we've run several studios since then. The most recent was with the special operations community, state and local law enforcement, FBI, a bunch of other security-related people around tackling illicit trafficking. Before that, we had a series of studios before the election, actually, on the future of civics. And then that initial studio with State Department, and actually a basket of federal agencies, was around the democratization of energy. Or,
interesting.
How do we enable this transition from centralized energy systems to diversified and decentralized energies? So that work gave me a different relationship to RISD and a different profile here. Mm-hmm. And it was something, as far as I know, there hadn't been much collaboration between, say, DoD and RISD.
Yeah.
And especially in this most recent one, actual special operators and RISD. And so actually the provost, Pradeep Sharma at the time, he just left earlier this year. He was looking for ways to bring in different ideas about what RISD should be into the community, not just sort of have a commentary about it, but actually bring them into the community, because RISD is, it's very much a teaching institution. There's not a lot of academic research as we would think about it at Harvard or another research university. Interesting. That doesn't really exist here. So it can be a little bit hard to change as a result. And so he he brought me in as in a new position called Provost Fellow, which was to still continue the work with the Institute for Design and Public Policy, but also to help him and others think about different academic futures for RISD. So that work was really varied in what I did, but it leads directly into what I'm doing now. And principally that has been around establishing a large partnership, probably the largest partnership in RISD's history, with Infosys, which is a Indian technology company.
Oh yeah.
And there are different elements to that we can get into, but the main sort of my main body of work will now be through what we're just launching is the Center for Complexity at RISD. And that's really a home for, to really push this work this kind of all of the work that I've been doing and others have been doing to push it forward into other domains, other spheres, to look at specifically at how creative practices of any kind. So RISD has design, but it also has an incredible fine arts program, right, and a really amazing liberal arts program. That how those creative practices can engage and navigate complex problems, how they can deal with, in a practical way, deal with uncertainty.
Yeah.
And so that's sort of where my focus now is beginning to coalesce around this new center.
It's interesting to kind of hear about this partnership and you mentioned kind of design thinking earlier and obviously talking about strategic design. This is a weird question. This might be too big of a question to even kind of think about, but I'm kind of curious about this word design and either kind of your relationship to it or why you think that word or the ideas around what design is a kind of possible solution or part of a solution to all of these kind of problems that we're talking about.
Yeah. In a few words or less.
Yeah, right.
My relationship with design has evolved a lot. And there were periods of my career, like when I was at the Finnish Innovation Fund, where I didn't really describe myself as a designer. I was doing things like trying to figure out what impact investing as a financial process should mean for Finland, because it wasn't happening there, but it seemed important. And I had access to people at Harvard that were really pushing the field. And so I was trying to do the same in Finland, or, around circular economy, and so the tools that I was using, it was all could be covered within a Microsoft platform, right? I was not using design tools. I was not necessarily using design language, and I was therefore not really identifying as a designer. And there were periods where I thought that's just like the surgeon identity and the architect identity, that maybe the design identity that had grown out of HDL is something that I would also be leaving behind. Yeah. And I think reconnecting to RISD and practice, at least in a classroom, going back into the work of HDL and others that have continued and really pushed that work much further than we could, has reinvested me in design as at least a framework. But I'm with you in not being entirely settled with that as some sort of sufficient definition.
Yeah,
I remember one of the debates really that we had when we were writing our first book, we call the Blue Book.
Oh yeah,
for HDL, was, do we need to make an argument about about the kind of training one has to have before we could consider them a designer. And this is really fraught territory,
Yeah.
right? Because you can't make that kind of judgment. But on the other hand, I do think there is tremendous value that comes out of being in a studio, having a huge question before you, and hour after hour after hour wrestling in a kind of open inquiry that problem.
Yeah.
So I do think that there's, at least we can say there's value in being trained as a designer in a studio environment. And, and then we can say there are other designers that just inherently act that way.
Right.
But in terms of rigor, that's a way to achieve a rigorous, methodology, a rigorous practice. And the way that I've come to think about design now, and this will change probably tomorrow, but is that it's a way to describe a methodical process of continually re-engaging the question of what should be.
I love that.
Right? Like,
yeah.
Not just saying that. I mean, this would be my critique of design thinking, is in the so-called ideation session, that's the closest thing you get to engaging this question of what should be. But if you're actually working as a designer, you need to go constantly after that question.
Yeah.
And answer it, put that out in the world and see what the world does to it, and then have to answer it again based on that new information. Design thinking doesn't do any of that, right? It's largely a linear process. So that's where I kind of land on it. So whether you call it design or something else, I don't know, but it's definitely not physics necessarily.
Right.
It is akin to a scientific process, although that's more an empirical analytical framework rather than saying here's a current state and we want something to be different.
Right.
And that's the start of then asking that question over and over and over again. Yeah.
That's great. I love that so much. I think you again have kind of really hit on like kind of that core of that, because that's kind of exactly been my question: is design even the right word for so many of these things? And that definition I think is great. My last two questions. These are questions that I ask everybody to kind of wrap up the conversation, and you've talked about some of this throughout. But what are some of the subjects or topics that are on your mind right now, or things that you're kind of thinking about and wrestling with?
Well, I mean, to sort of close the book on design thinking, I think there's a need now to really confront the potential threat that poses to designers, and try to articulate the deficiencies in a design thinking approach to, I hear so often people say, I'm just going to DT that, as if, design thinking is just, it's just one of many toolkits rather than a mindset. And, right now I'm today and for the next few weeks, I'm running the 7-week program on strategic design. We call it the RISD Strategic Design Institute, and it's part of this Infosys partnership. But this is trying to first of all make design thinking a sort of untenable, to make these people intolerant to that idea, to instill in them mindsets, not tools, and to push them to be always starting with systems thinking, not design thinking. I accept systems thinking as a part of practice, but so anyway, that's one thing, and that also is continuing to work from HDL in a certain way. But I'm really interested in organizational transformation, whether it's formal organizations, loose organizations. I mentioned the work with the special operations community.
Right.
They face some really interesting challenges because up until the Afghanistan war, up until 2001 or so, their warfighters were both warfighters and diplomats, and they knew how to do those jobs equally well. And because of the intensity of Afghanistan and then Iraq, they had to really become warfighters. And this became then a generation of people that are incredibly skilled kinetic operators, right? But they need that diplomatic capability. And the interesting thing is that they've identified design as a way to help build that capacity. So there's this thing called the soft design way, special operations forces design way. And, we're helping them think through that. So that's an example of the kind of the organizational transformation. But whether it's UN or whoever, there's a very different world out there than the one for which they were designed.
Right.
And that process of it's not lights on, lights off. We're a new organization. It's a transitional process, and that really engages me. And whatever the topic is, that's just sort of side benefit.
Yeah.
Whether it's special operations or UN or we're starting a project right now with N Square, which is a nuclear threat reduction group.
Wow.
So those are sort of the topics are just new chances to learn.
Yeah.
But there's a similarity in that need to transform from one thing to another.
Yeah. My last question is, and this is how I end all of these conversations. I'm curious, if there are, someone listening to this and is kind of really liking the types of things that you're talking about, are there books or writers or critics or, even practitioners who have really kind of shaped how you think about this that you would recommend as kind of must reads?
Yeah. I mean, it's a long,
right. Yeah, of course.
List. We have a pretty intense reading element to this summer program that we're running. But I don't know. My reading list has been people like Yuval Harari and *Sapiens*. That was transformative for me in a lot of ways because in that he's making the argument that that our dominance as a species is a product of our ability to cooperate, and the key to our successful cooperation is the ability to tell each other myths and fictions, and then you tie that to trying to understand what a designer does, and the way that I see that is, good designers tell better myths that make more people cooperate in that potential future to make that realized. So for me, that was also empowering because, to illustrate this brilliantly, he points at money as the greatest myth ever told.
Right.
There's no inherent value in myth. So that sort of opens up, especially in the organizational transformation space, it opens up the ability to change things that seem unchangeable. That there are no natural laws that govern how the UN operates. For instance, gravity is not driving it, right? It's myths that people have told each other, and so we can tell new ones. Yeah. So that's for me been really interesting. There's one that I'm working into by Helga Nowotny called "The Cunning of Uncertainty."
Oh, I don't know.
She's the president of the European Research Council, I think, and she's in that exploring how sort of celebrating how uncertainty has helped advance society, through a science lens, but still very relevant. There's another one that is very interesting, I think, called Utopia as Method. So I'm getting that right.
I don't know this.
Which it says that whenever we try to, in thinking about the future, if we're using utopia as a destination, we're not using it correctly as a way to think. That It's a methodology to explore alternate futures and to learn about the present and where we want to go. But if it's ever used purposefully as a final place, again, a destination, then it sort of destroys any good process. So it's stuff like that I'm really interested in. And of course, just, I think if you want to work in a strategic space, one thing that I have to do a lot as a facilitator is complicate people's certainty about issues. And the only way that I can do that, the way that I know how to do that effectively is to provide evidence that their certainty is, at least they shouldn't be so certain.
Right.
What they're thinking about. And the way to do that is to constantly be reading, The Economist and the Times and all of the, especially the longer form analysis of what's happening in our world. Because a lot of those certainties that they bring into a studio, whether it's a special operator or somebody from DoD, it's coming from a glance at some issue and not a deeper investigation. So if you can, on the spot, bring that in as a facilitator, it just, it keeps the balls in the air so that we don't lock into any kind of solution to it.
Yeah.
So that's a few.
Yeah, no, I love that. That was a perfect way to end this. And Sapiens is a book that's come up a couple times on the podcast, and it's been on my list for a while, and you've put me over the edge where I think it's time that I bump that up the queue.
It's really transformative, I think.
Adding it to my cart right now.
Okay, good.
Justin, this was so great. I found this conversation so fascinating. I'm a big fan of the way you think about all of these things, and like I said a couple times throughout the conversation, I feel like you've helped me connect things that have just been on my mind in general. So thank you so much for this conversation and taking the time to be on the podcast.
Oh, thank you, Jarrett. I appreciate it.
This episode was recorded on August 1st, 2018. Our theme music is by Andy Borgasani. We're on Twitter and Instagram at Surface Podcast. You can find us on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, SoundCloud, and at scratchingthesurface.fm. Thanks for listening.